He had survived 3 tours of duty in combat zones, witnessed horrors that would break most men, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he found when he returned home unannounced. There, in what used to be their warm family kitchen, his little girl was drinking from a dog bowl on the floor. But it wasn't the sight that destroyed him. It was when she looked up, saw him standing there, and her first words in 2 years weren't "Daddy" or even "help." She whispered, with water still dripping from her chin, "I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to use my hands." Staff Sergeant Thaddeus Thad Ravencroft had been many things in his 42 years. A Special Forces operative, a demolitions expert, a man who could survive in any hostile environment the world could throw at him. His hands, scarred from countless missions, had built safe houses in Afghanistan, diffused bombs in Iraq, and carried wounded brothers to safety under enemy fire. But those same hands now trembled as he stared at his 6-year-old daughter, Ophelia Leah Ravencroft, kneeling on their kitchen floor like a broken animal. The military had forged him into an instrument of precision and power. 3 deployments across 2 years had earned him medals, commendations, and the respect of every soldier who'd served alongside him. His commanding officers called him Raven, a predator who struck swift and sure, always bringing his team home alive. He'd faced insurgents, survived IED explosions, and never once wavered under pressure. Yet here, in the suburban home he'd bought with his combat pay, watching his own flesh and blood reduced to this state, the unbreakable soldier felt something crack deep inside his chest. Ophelia had been his entire world before the deployment. She wasn't just any 6-year-old. She was brilliance wrapped in pigtails and fairy wings. Her laugh could fill rooms, her questions could stump professors, and her imagination could turn cardboard boxes into space stations. She spoke in complete sentences before she was 2, taught herself to read by age 4, and had a vocabulary that amazed her teachers. But the child before him now bore little resemblance to that vibrant little girl. This Ophelia moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who'd learned that sudden movements brought pain. Her once bright eyes were dull, constantly scanning for threats. When she spoke, it was in whispers, as if her voice itself was dangerous. The transformation was so complete, it physically hurt to witness. This wasn't his daughter. This was what remained after someone had systematically broken her spirit. 2 years ago, their morning routine had been sacred. Thad would wake before dawn, prepare his coffee, and wait for the sound of small feet racing down the hardwood stairs. Ophelia would burst into the kitchen, wearing whatever princess dress she'd chosen for the day, demanding her special cup, a pink unicorn mug that made her feel royal during breakfast. "Daddy, did you put magic in my orange juice?" she'd ask with deadly seriousness. "Of course, little sparrow," he'd reply, kissing her forehead. "What kind would you like today? Courage magic or wisdom magic?" She'd consider this with the gravity of a philosopher. "Wisdom magic, please. I have a spelling test." Those mornings felt like a lifetime ago. The pink unicorn mug now sat forgotten in the cabinet, collecting dust while his daughter lapped water from a dented metal bowl, like an animal who'd forgotten it was human. The day he'd received his deployment orders, he'd knelt beside her bed and made a promise. "Daddy has to go help some people far away, but I'll come back with the biggest, most beautiful cup in the whole world just for you." She'd wrapped her small arms around his neck. "Promise you won't forget me?" "Never, little sparrow. Never in a million years." The deployment hadn't been optional. When your country calls, a soldier answers, especially one with Thad's specialized skills. The mission was classified, high-stakes work that required months of deep cover operations in hostile territory. The kind of assignment that could end wars or start them, depending on how well it was executed. But it was also the financial opportunity his family needed. Military pay was steady but modest. The deployment bonuses, hazard pay, and overseas allowances would set them up for years. Ophelia could attend the best schools, go to college debt-free, have opportunities he'd never dreamed of as a kid from the wrong side of Detroit. Still, leaving her had torn him apart. The night before his departure, he'd sat in her bedroom watching her sleep, memorizing every detail of her peaceful face. Part of him wanted to refuse the assignment, resign his commission, find some other way to provide for her. But duty called, and Thaddeus Ravencroft had never been the kind of man who ran from duty. Finding someone to care for Ophelia during his absence had seemed like providence. Veronica Thornfield arrived in their lives exactly when they needed her most. A former military wife who understood the demands of service, with impeccable references and a warm smile that put both father and daughter at ease. "I lost my husband in Kandahar 3 years ago," she'd explained during their first meeting, her eyes appropriately misty. "Taking care of military children is my way of honoring his memory. Ophelia will be safe with me, Sergeant Ravencroft. I'll treat her like my own daughter." The background check had been flawless. 2 years as a registered childcare provider, glowing testimonials from 3 military families, certification in child development, and emergency medical training. She even had a degree in elementary education from a respectable state university. More importantly, Ophelia had taken to her immediately. Veronica knew all the princess movies, could braid hair into elaborate designs, and promised to maintain all of Ophelia's routines exactly as Thad had established them. "Daddy," Ophelia had whispered on his last night home, "I like Miss Veronica. She smells like cookies and she says she'll teach me French." He'd signed the guardianship papers without hesitation, grateful beyond measure that his daughter would be in such caring hands. The transformation began exactly 12 hours after Thad's transport left American soil. Veronica's warm smile vanished the moment Ophelia waved goodbye to her father's departing taxi. The woman who'd spent weeks charming them both with homemade cookies and bedtime stories revealed her true face, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. "Well, little princess," Veronica said, her voice now dripping with disdain, "let's get something straight. This isn't your house anymore. You're living in my house now, and you'll follow my rules." Ophelia, still processing her father's departure, looked up confused. "But Daddy said—" "Your daddy isn't here," Veronica cut her off sharply, "and he's not coming back anytime soon, so you better start learning how things work around here." The first rule was silence. Children, according to Veronica, were meant to be neither seen nor heard unless specifically summoned. Speaking without permission earned a sharp slap across the face. The second rule was absolute obedience. Any hesitation, any question, any sign of resistance brought swift and painful consequences. Within a week, Ophelia learned to move through the house like a ghost, always alert for Veronica's moods, always ready to disappear at the first sign of anger. The systematic dehumanization escalated with terrifying speed. First, Veronica removed Ophelia from the dining table. "Animals eat on the floor," she announced, placing a metal dog bowl where Ophelia's plate used to be. "And since you can't seem to remember your manners, you'll eat like the animal you are." When Ophelia protested, still naive enough to believe this was some kind of mistake, Veronica grabbed her by the hair and forced her face into the bowl. "This is how dogs eat," she hissed. "No hands, no sitting up. If you spill a single drop, you don't eat for the rest of the day." The psychological torture was methodical and cruel. Veronica would call her "it" instead of using her name. She was forbidden to speak unless spoken to, forbidden to use furniture, forbidden to sleep in her own bed. Instead, she was given a blanket in the laundry room, told that proper children slept in beds while animals slept on floors. Each degradation was accompanied by a simple phrase: "This is what you deserve. This is what you are." The physical abuse followed a pattern too, always where marks wouldn't show, always with plausible explanations ready if anyone asked questions. A bruised wrist from falling downstairs, a split lip from running into a door, red marks on her back from playing too rough. But the cruelest torture was the complete isolation. Veronica intercepted every call from Thad, coaching Ophelia on exactly what to say. "I'm fine, Daddy. Miss Veronica takes good care of me. I miss you, but I'm being brave like you taught me." Any deviation from the script meant no food for 2 days. Mrs. Eleanor Weatherby, the elderly neighbor who'd lived next door for 30 years, was the first to notice something was wrong. She'd always enjoyed watching Ophelia play in the backyard, the little girl's laughter carrying over the fence like music. But after Thad left, the laughter stopped. Instead, she glimpsed fleeting shadows, a small figure scurrying between rooms, never lingering in one place long enough to be seen clearly. Once she thought she saw Ophelia eating from a bowl on the back porch, hunched over like an animal, but surely that couldn't be right. At Millbrook Elementary, Ophelia's teacher, Mrs. Catherine Brightwater watched with growing concern as her brightest student transformed into a hollow shell. The girl who'd once raised her hand for every question now sat silent and motionless. Her essays, formerly creative and detailed, became single-sentence responses in barely legible handwriting. During lunch, Mrs. Brightwater noticed Ophelia never brought food from home anymore, never asked to buy lunch from the cafeteria. When questioned, the girl would mumble something about not being hungry, then spend the lunch period sitting alone in the corner. Most troubling were the physical signs. Ophelia had always been petite, but now she was gaunt. Dark circles ringed her eyes. She startled at sudden movements, flinched when adults approached too quickly, and seemed constantly afraid of making mistakes. But when Mrs. Brightwater called the house to express her concerns, Veronica was ready with explanations. "Oh, the poor dear is just adjusting to her father's deployment. You know how sensitive military children can be. I'm keeping her on a strict diet and bedtime routine to help with the transition." Dr. Marcus Holloway, Ophelia's pediatrician, felt similar unease during her regular checkup. The child who'd always chattered non-stop about her father, her friends, her favorite books, now answered every question with single-word responses. Her weight had dropped 15 pounds, significant for a 6-year-old frame. But again, Veronica was prepared. "She's been picky about eating since her father left. I'm working with a nutritionist to develop meal plans she'll accept." Each potential rescuer was neutralized with reasonable explanations, leaving Ophelia trapped with no one to turn to. 3,000 miles away, Thad felt something wrong in his bones. Their weekly video calls had become increasingly strange. Ophelia, once bubbling with stories about school and friends, now sat motionless while Veronica answered most questions for her. "She's just tired," Veronica would explain whenever Thad asked why his daughter seemed so subdued. "You know how overwhelming school can be at her age." But Thad knew his daughter. He'd raised her alone since her mother died in a car accident when Ophelia was 2. He knew her every expression, every mannerism, every tell. The girl on the screen looked like Ophelia, but she moved like a prisoner, careful, controlled, constantly glancing off camera as if checking for approval. His special forces training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. He started asking pointed questions. "Leah, are you sleeping well? Are you eating enough? Is Miss Veronica treating you kindly?" Each question earned the same hollow response. "Yes, Daddy, everything's fine." But her eyes told a different story. They held a desperate sadness that made his chest tight with panic. She was trying to tell him something without words, pleading with him through the screen in ways she apparently couldn't voice. His commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison, had served long enough to recognize a soldier in distress. When Thad requested emergency leave, Morrison didn't hesitate. "Your head's not in the mission, Raven," he said, "and a distracted soldier gets people killed. Go home, figure out what's wrong, come back when you're ready to fight again." The flight home felt endless. Thad's mind raced through every possibility, each scenario worse than the last. Maybe Ophelia was sick, and Veronica was trying to protect him from worry. Maybe she was struggling in school and felt ashamed to tell him. Maybe she'd simply outgrown their father-daughter bond and was pulling away as children sometimes did. But deep down, he knew it was none of these things. His daughter was in trouble, real, immediate trouble, and he'd failed to protect her when she needed him most. The taxi ride from the airport through their suburban neighborhood felt surreal. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it. The same manicured lawns, the same white picket fences, the same American flags hanging from porches. A peaceful slice of middle-class paradise where nothing bad was supposed to happen. He'd deliberately not called ahead, wanting to surprise Ophelia and see her genuine reaction. Now he questioned that decision. What if his sudden appearance frightened her? What if she'd genuinely forgotten him after 2 years apart? As the taxi pulled up to their house, Thad noticed the windows were all curtained shut despite the beautiful afternoon weather. The yard, which he'd always kept immaculate, was overgrown with weeds. The mailbox hung crooked, as if it had been damaged and never repaired. Small details, but they fed his growing sense of dread. Thad paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, gathering his courage. Then he walked around to the back of the house, hoping to glimpse Ophelia through the kitchen window before announcing his presence. What he saw through that window shattered every assumption he'd held about the world. His daughter, his brilliant, beautiful, beloved daughter, was on her hands and knees on the kitchen floor. Her hair hung limp and unwashed around her face. Her clothes were stained and too large, hanging off her diminished frame like rags on a scarecrow. And she was drinking from a metal dog bowl. Not eating from it. Drinking. Lapping water like an animal who'd forgotten it was human. Her small face was pressed close to the bowl's rim, her tongue darting out to catch every drop. She moved with practiced efficiency, as if this were routine, normal, expected. Thad's legs gave out. He caught himself against the window frame, his hands shaking so violently he could barely maintain his grip. Every instinct screamed at him to crash through that window, to scoop her up and carry her away from this nightmare. But training and shock held him frozen for precious seconds that felt like hours. Then Ophelia sensed his presence. She looked up, water dripping from her chin, and their eyes met through the glass. Recognition flickered across her gaunt face. Joy, terror, hope, and shame, all warring for dominance in her expression. She scrambled to her feet with the quick, nervous movements of someone accustomed to punishment for being caught in forbidden acts. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear through the glass, but he could read them clearly enough. "I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to use my hands." Those words hit him like a sniper's bullet, precise and devastating. His daughter was apologizing to him, apologizing for drinking water, for being caught in the act of trying to survive, for existing in a way that someone had taught her was wrong. In that moment, Staff Sergeant Thaddeus Ravencroft made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. The broken child in that kitchen wasn't just his daughter anymore. She was his mission, his purpose, his reason for drawing breath. And failure was not an option. The back door wasn't locked, a detail that would later strike Thad as significant. As if Veronica's arrogance was so complete, she felt no need for security. He moved through his own house like an intruder, every sense hyper-aware, processing the changes that spoke of another person's dominance over his domain. The family photos had been removed from the hallway. Ophelia's artwork no longer covered the refrigerator. The air smelled wrong, harsh cleaning chemicals mixed with something else, something that made his nostrils flare with recognition. Fear. The house reeked of fear. He found them in the kitchen. Veronica stood at the counter with her back to him, calmly preparing what looked like a normal lunch. Ophelia remained on the floor beside the dog bowl, trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice cut through the domestic scene like a blade. Veronica turned slowly, and Thad saw something in her eyes that chilled him more than enemy fire ever had. Complete lack of surprise at his presence, as if she'd been expecting this moment and had already planned her response. "Thaddeus," she said with disturbing calm, "you're early. I wasn't expecting you until next month. Answer my question." He stepped between Veronica and his daughter, his body automatically shifting into a defensive stance. "Why is my child drinking from a dog bowl?" Veronica's laugh was like ice cracking. "Your child has behavioral issues, I'm afraid." She refused to use cups properly, kept spilling water everywhere, making messes. This was the only way to teach her responsibility. The lie was so smooth, so rehearsed, that for a split second, Thad almost questioned what he'd seen with his own eyes. Then he looked down at Ophelia, still crouched on the floor, and saw the truth written in every line of her diminished body. Behavioral issues. His voice dropped to the deadly whisper his enemies learned to fear. "She's 6 years old. She's manipulative," Veronica continued, her mask finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath, constantly testing boundaries, refusing to follow simple rules. "I've been trying to teach her discipline, something she clearly never learned before." Thad knelt beside his daughter, his hands gentle despite the fury burning in his chest. "Leah, baby, look at me." Ophelia raised her head with visible effort, and he saw the full extent of what had been done to her. Bruises faded to yellow around her wrists. Her lips were chapped and cracked. Most heartbreaking of all, she flinched away from his touch, not from pain, but from learned expectation that contact meant punishment. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I tried to be good. I really tried." The world went red around the edges. What happened next would be dissected later by police, social workers, and military investigators. Thad's training kicked in with surgical precision, not the berserker rage that civilian fathers might experience, but the cold, controlled fury of a special forces operative who'd found his primary objective under direct threat. He gathered evidence first. His phone captured photos of the dog bowl, still wet with saliva. He documented the empty refrigerator, the locked pantry, the makeshift bed in the laundry room where his daughter had been forced to sleep. Every bruise, every sign of neglect, every indication of systematic abuse was recorded with methodical thoroughness. Veronica watched with growing panic as her carefully constructed lies crumbled under his professional documentation. "You can't prove anything," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "It's your word against mine, and I have 2 years of exemplary childcare records." "Actually," Thad replied without looking up from his phone, "you have 2 years of fraud, child abuse, and conspiracy to commit extortion of military benefits." He'd already spotted the stack of military family support checks on the counter, payments that were supposed to ensure Ophelia's care, but had clearly been used for Veronica's personal expenses instead. That's when Veronica made her fatal mistake. She lunged toward Ophelia, perhaps thinking to use the child as leverage, or maybe just acting on pure vicious instinct. She never made contact. Thad moved with fluid precision, intercepting her advance and applying a restraint hold that left her immobilized but unharmed. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't give me a reason." The 911 call brought 3 patrol units, an ambulance, and a Child Protective Services investigator to the scene within 12 minutes. By then, Thad had Ophelia wrapped in a blanket from his duffel bag, the first clean fabric she'd touched in months. Detective Sarah McKenna, a 20-year veteran who'd worked hundreds of child abuse cases, later said she'd never seen evidence so thoroughly documented by a civilian. Thad's military precision had created an airtight case before the first responder arrived. The charges against Veronica mounted quickly: aggravated child abuse, fraudulent acceptance of military benefits, endangerment of a minor, and conspiracy to commit welfare fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable. But for Thad, the legal proceedings were secondary to his real mission: healing his broken daughter. Word spread through the military community with the speed of jungle drums. Thad's unit, still deployed overseas, pooled their resources to hire the best civilian attorney money could buy. Other military families who'd used Veronica's services came forward with their own suspicions and stories. Mrs. Weatherby organized a neighborhood vigil, standing outside the courthouse during Veronica's arraignment, with a sign reading, "Protect our children." The local VFW post established a fund for Ophelia's medical and psychological care. Most importantly, Dr. Lisa Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in military families, volunteered her services pro bono after seeing the case coverage on the news. Veronica's trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented a case so damning that her own attorney advised a guilty plea. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with mandatory registration as a child abuser upon release. But more than legal justice, there was social reckoning. Her name became synonymous with betrayal of military families. The childcare company that had recommended her faced federal investigation. The background check system that had failed to detect her previous offenses was completely overhauled. Ophelia never had to testify. Thad's documentation and the physical evidence spoke louder than any 6-year-old's testimony could have. Recovery was measured in tiny victories. The first time Ophelia drank from a real cup, Thad cried harder than he had at any funeral. When she slept through an entire night without nightmares, it felt like winning a war. Dr. Chen worked with them both, helping Thad understand the depth of his daughter's trauma, while teaching Ophelia that she was safe to be human again. There were setbacks, days when Ophelia reverted to old survival behaviors, nights when she woke screaming, moments when she still apologized for existing. But there were breakthroughs too. The day she laughed at one of his bad jokes. The afternoon she asked him to read her a story. The morning she called him Daddy instead of Sir for the first time in 2 years. 6 months later, Thad took early retirement from the military. His daughter needed him more than his country did, and for the first time in his adult life, the choice was easy. They moved across the country to a small town where nobody knew their story. Thad found work as a security consultant, jobs that let him work from home and be present for every moment of Ophelia's healing. She started at a new school where her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, created a safe space for a little girl learning to be a child again. Slowly, carefully, Ophelia began to bloom. The pink unicorn mug came out of the cabinet. Morning routines were re-established. Bedtime stories resumed. One evening, as Thad tucked her into her own bed, the first bed she'd slept in for 2 years, Ophelia looked up at him with eyes that were beginning to remember how to trust. "Daddy," she whispered. "Yes, little sparrow. Thank you for coming home." He kissed her forehead, just like he used to do, just like he always would. "I promised I'd never forget you, not in a million years." Outside, the world continued its rotation, indifferent to the small miracles happening in suburban bedrooms. But inside that house, a father and daughter were learning that love could survive anything, heal anything, overcome anything. Even when that love comes home to find its most precious treasure, drinking from a dog bowl on the kitchen floor, whispering apologies for the crime of existing. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil against enemy combatants. Sometimes they're fought in American kitchens against monsters who smile while they destroy innocent souls. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. Not because they're stronger or better armed, but because they refuse to surrender what matters most: their children's right to be human.